Hi, Jason. How's it going?
Good, Zara. Nice to be here.
I'm glad to have you on. Super excited. I know you're super busy and you've recently come out with a new book. So very excited to have you on today.
Good.
All right. First question. What do you do and what's your creative process?
So I am presently associate professor and head of department at the American University of Sharjah in the Department of Architecture. So I trained as an architect. I've been practicing and teaching for a long time. And I think in the past 20 or so years, I've been really kind of more focused on teaching. And in the last 8 or so years since I've been at AUS, teaching as well as a little bit of practice or creative work here and there. I would say before coming to Sharjah, I was more active in practice and creative work in Hong Kong. In a sense, there it was an earlier part of my career. I was running a practice, living in the city, and didn't have the administrative duties that I have now, nor the family that I have now. So that idea of kind of teaching and practicing together was a vehicle for creativity, and then thinking about architectural practice or designing interiors, and then applying that to my teaching and vice versa, right? Like thinking about going through not necessarily my own creative projects, but creative projects with students. And that was also sometimes inspiring for my own work.
That's super interesting to see it in that lens. So my next question is, what role does research and exploration play in your practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always been there. And I think this is what we try to teach and transfer to students while we're in architecture school or design school in general, is to kind of come up with some sort of methodology to approach problems, right? Now, I could also say that part of my creative practice now is actually designing studios or designing projects for students to take on. And I think there's also a little bit of designing creativity in that process. I think a lot of what I've always done is looked at precedent. So if I'm working on a specific type of project, I think looking around to kind of see what's been done before, and to understand other people's approaches to it. Because I think that, design is a conversation that you have with the project itself, or perhaps with a client, or with a student, but it's also, in a sense, a historical conversation with what's come before, and thus trying to understand what makes this particular project or problem different than what came before that, right? So I think precedent study and thinking about those examples is a big part of both creative practice and teaching. So precedent is one thing. I think integration is another thing that I'm very interested in, right? How processes are or forms get integrated with each other. Earlier in my career, I was really interested in drawing and modeling softwares and thinking about how form and use could be integrated in different ways through advanced software, right? So integration or blending through the act of drawing and designing and model building was a part of that as well.
Yeah, and I think it's quite evident for people who don't know. I was Jason's student, and even the other studios, there's so much model building and there's such an emphasis on drawing, which is quite nice, to see that kind of change, and especially in architecture school when it's such a special feeling when you enter the architecture department and you see all the studios with all these huge models and drawings pinned up everywhere. So yeah. Now, can you please tell us about your new book, Cities of Repetition, which has to do with Hong Kong's private housing estates?
Yeah, thanks. So the book is relatively recently published, but it's been a project for over a decade. The book was co-authored between me and my former colleague at University of Hong Kong, Christian Lang. And Christian and I were both teaching studios together around the theme of housing. And we're both living in Hong Kong, but came from other places. So I had come from the United States and he had come from Germany. And one thing that struck us when we were living in that city for a number of years was how closely the the form and the shape and the organization of many buildings was to each other. And so we started thinking of a relationship in Hong Kong of building form to building code and how code and building regulations in that particular city really kind of drove the shape of buildings, optimized things like floor plans and tower layouts over a course of decades in the latter half of the 20th century. So part of this is that Christian and I were also both interested in, again, in modeling technology, how through advanced modeling you could achieve a lot of heterogeneity, right? You could set up parametric models and you could have, hundreds of outcomes by changing a few different criteria. So this idea of heterogeneity versus standardization was a theme that we wanted to think about. And this, again, this idea of relationship to software, but also in relationship to how you structure the building requirements for a specific city or place. So the book, again, started with an analysis of building codes over time, and then looking at specific towers that have a kind of cruciform floor plan, right? So kind of a cross-shaped floor plan. And we looked at building codes around fire regulations, around, vertical circulation, around, the codes that determine how the windows were shaped and formed for natural ventilation that all seem to kind of lead back to this highly optimal floor plan that then, of course, gets extruded over the course of 20 or 30 or 40 stories and then copied and pasted across a large estate to create these kind of cities of repetition. So the book is what we think of as a kind of an atlas, drawings that go into a very kind of deep analysis and documentation of the 10 largest privately developed housing estates in Hong Kong, which were built from 1965 through the late 90s, kind of to the year 2000. And that was this kind of really interesting window in time where private developers working with architects kind of figured out the optimal floor plan, and then the optimal floor plan led to kind of an optimal profit, right? So the other quote that we think of when we were writing the book and interviewing people and doing research was this idea that form follows finance, right? That you optimize the space and the saleable area in the architecture, and then leads to profits for the developer. And at the end of the day, it also satisfies a huge demand for housing in the city of Hong Kong. So on one hand, it's creating housing for profit. On the other hand, it's creating housing at a cheaper price through the power of standardization and repetition to house a growing population in those years, right, where the GDP was growing, manufacturing was growing, population was growing. So housing really needed to kind of keep up with that. So I would say at the beginning of the project, Christian and I kind of thought about the analysis as a kind of critique of overly used standardization and repetition in these estates. But as we developed it, we also found that there were lots of ways in which architects figured out ways to kind of plug in different types of units, especially in some of the older, more diverse estates, and create, densities of building, densities of population that were really not seen in many other places around the world, right? Hyperdense communities that, when we think about global climate change and carbon footprint, actually reduce the footprint of all of the individuals living there. So at the end, we think of it as the pros and cons about standardization and repetition that contribute to these estates. But we worked with a fantastic graphic designer named Kai Bachmann, who's in Leipzig, Germany, and he really helped us to kind of think about the analysis through color and through graphics and through chronological drawing of all of these hundreds of floor plans and hundreds of units
Yeah.
to organize the work into something that I think that is quite interesting and compelling,
Yeah.
even though it's highly standardized.
I totally agree. Thank you for such a thoughtful answer. And when you talk about the graphic design of the book, I think it's so interesting because I got the chance to flip through and look through the book, which is quite amazing. Whoever's interested, get your copy. But the graphic design was so interesting to study on its own in the way that color is used to, divide topics and organize such a huge density of information. I think it's quite remarkable for graphic designers who are also, watching this. Do check it out. And yeah, the book is so intensive and it's quite rich with a lot of wonderful diagrams and drawings, and it's quite a thick book. So I believe you when you say it's a super long project, through the years you've been working on this. So what was the most challenging part of documenting and then analyzing all the different estates?
Well, in some ways, it was the sheer amount of drawing that it took to kind of redraw all of these. So we went through with an army of research assistants over the years, mostly from Hong Kong U, but also from AUS. We, we redrew and remodeled everything ourselves so that we could have this library of drawings that we could analyze in terms of floor plan area, in terms of, the analysis of how much window space there is or how much kitchen space there is. So I think drawing all of it, going through the analyses, and then trying to kind of figure out, what do we want to compare and contrast within those analyses, right? And then what's the clearest way to do it through numerical data, through the floor plans themselves, and through graphical analysis. So when you get to towards the back of the book in the analysis area, this is where our designer Kai really kind of helped, was to take our drawings, our base drawings, to kind of how color can, clarify. And in the case of the book, color is like a spectrum that shows the smallest units to the largest units. So you can see how unit size changes over time, or how the variety of unit sizes is reduced over time as estates become more standardized. But also, thinking about showing graphs of things like floor plan efficiency in a chart, or Christian ways of using Grasshopper and Rhino to create measured charts that actually use the floor plans of the units as the points on the chart, right? So I think that richness of using icons, again, comparing things like scale and density, as well as repetition through just overlaying the units or the towers on top of each other to see how many outlines there are, right? So very basic ideas of graphic design that, again, really rich and compelling ways to compare and contrast. So yeah, a big part of the book was thinking through that.
Yeah.
And then organizing it, trying to make sure it fit within the pages.
Yeah.
There's parts that are black and white, parts that are color, and all of that has to kind of work out with efficiency of printing too. So
Yeah.
we learned a lot about the art bookmaking along this
Yeah.
from.
Exactly. It's such a vigorous body of work. Also rational, but at the same time artistic. It's really beautiful looking at those diagrams like individually on its own. Just like the amount of thoughtfulness that's gone into it is just remarkable. So thank you for doing this research and compiling this wonderful book. Um, what do you hope that readers take away from this, like architects, urban planners, anyone?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's the book presents two sides of this argument of housing design and housing estates, right? And how we might start to think of cities in the future. So I think in some ways it's kind of a warning to architects or developers that when everything is overly standardized, then you might start to lead to communities that are very singular in the types of families or individuals that they can house,
Mm,
right? if the whole city or neighborhood two-bedroom apartments, then it might lack some of the heterogeneity, makes neighborhoods more diverse, right? Having young people and older people together. So I think that idea of watching out for over standardization and providing neighborhoods that have a range of housing types so that people can choose or adapt as their families grow is really important. On the other hand, I think again, it could be used as kind of how-to, right? As how do you create a kind of a building type which would offer growth and expansion and efficiency in cities that need more housing? How can you pack towers together and still allow for views and air and light to get in, but create densities or population densities that reduce transportational carbon, that create very dynamic to the city. And one thing that we didn't really cover in the book that much is how the podia or the bases of these towers work. Right? We focused a lot on the towers, but all of these housing estates, when you get to the bottom of the towers, there's supermarkets, there's shopping, there is public transportation. And that is one of the most important aspects of these too, especially for cities like Dubai. Think about how high densities of housing can be linked to dynamic parts of the city and to public transportation so that we don't all need to drive a car, right? The city can kind of be linked and smooth in other ways.
That'd be super interesting for book number two, in the
Yeah.
future. Yeah,
Yeah, the top and the bottom of the estates is really kind of interesting.
yeah. So what are you currently exploring in your work and what's next for you?
Yeah, well, like I said, this project started over 10 years ago while we were both living in Hong Kong. And since moving to Sharjah in 2016, I've retained this interest in housing and this interest in density. So in some ways, it's recontextualizing those themes within a new context, right? Within the context of the UAE. So I've been working on studios, for example, that think about denser housing or tower typologies and how towers might be designed to be better suited to the extreme climates of the Middle East. I think that's important for many cities going forward too. And then thinking about areas of the city that the industrial districts in Sharjah or Dubai that are industrial, but actually house a lot of people at the same time. So how can we think about new models of housing that improve the conditions for the people who live there, or housing that blends like as it is in Hong Kong? Buildings often carry in one thing, right? There are towers that are hybrid in terms of their program that mix living and working together, or living and recreation or dining together. So, thinking about high density, compact cities that can be diverse in their program and offer new types of living and housing for the 21st century, right? How might a tower in Dubai need to be different than a tower in China or New York or Paris, right? So I think it's always kind of thinking about life and technology, climate, and context to kind of reconsider what housing should be for a new society and in a new place with a new set of challenges.
Awesome. That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for the research that you do, that the publications that you work on that lead to more research and more questioning. And I think that even your book, Cities of Repetition, it's a very fitting title. The topics covered with standardization and code, not only concepts that can be applied to Hong Kong, but also places like Dubai and other places in the world. So it's a really nice starting point. And yeah, whoever reads the book, will sort of try to relate to those topics and concepts no matter where they are in the world. So,
Yeah, and it probably tells a different story in different places too. Interesting. So I look forward to hearing people's thoughts. Feel
yeah,
free to reach out and let me know what you think.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and all the best with all your projects.
Thanks, Sarah.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.